Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. I'm delighted to have as a guest again Paul Barnes, film editor for the PBS TV series The Vietnam War. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me back again.
Well, tell me a little about your background, because we're going to focus on the Vietnam War, but you have an extensive background.
Well, I've worked with Ken Burns on his projects for over 30 years, including the Civil War, baseball, jazz,
The Roosevelts,
national parks, all those series. So the Vietnam War was my last one, and I'm retired now. So
Good. Well, one of the taglines for the Vietnam War, it's actually on the poster, it says, "The Vietnam War, there is no single truth in war." And so what I love about this series, and it is 10 episodes, 18 hours.
Right.
Let's put it in context right now. We're showing this program at the beginning of the second week. We had you on a couple of weeks ago talking about an overall look at the series. But now that people have seen a week of it, that's 4 nights, Sunday through Thursday, two times a night in case they missed the first showing. What should they look for in this second really dramatic week?
I mean, some incredibly powerful material is contained in this second week. For example, tonight you're going to see the Tet offensive. That episode is actually grueling. I mean, it's actually a very difficult watch. But it's well worth it because I think you'll understand Tet better. I mean, many people misunderstand it and think it was a total failure on the part of the Americans and the South Vietnamese, but we actually won that battle. You'll also see Kent State, which is a beautifully edited scene, and I think there's some details in there that nobody knows much about in relation to that. You're also going to see the extraordinary scene when the Vietnam veterans against the war threw their medals back on the stairs of Congress, which is a heartbreaking sequence. And then, of course, we're going to feature Kerry's speech, which is very controversial, and it'll be interesting for the audience to see the way in which Ken has done it, because I think he gives a very good, it's kind of a give and take in the way in which we've dealt with Kerry and that controversy involving his speech. And then one of the concluding sequences is, of course, the building of the memorial wall, which always moves me to tears every time I go there and was very difficult to work on emotionally, but I think is one of the most powerful moments in the whole series.
I want to talk about that in depth in a little bit. It still, after the third time of watching it, still brings me to tears, too.
Yeah, me too. Still.
Wonderful piece of work.
Right.
I want to look at why it was so important for Ken and Lynn Novick, to approach Vietnam now. And can you mention Ken had chosen this project because he felt that the seeds to our toxic partisanship and our inability to even relate red state to blue state, the seeds to this were in Vietnam. Talk a little about that and why he thought a calm discussion 50 years later we could heal that.
No, absolutely. It's the divisions within the country really did start back then in the Vietnam era. And because Ken had done the Civil War, which showed the country at the last time it was so highly divided, North and South, and he grew up during the Vietnam era. And so since the Vietnam era, he has seen this political division just grow and grow and grow over time. And again, recognizing that the seeds of it were in Vietnam, having made the Civil War and the war, two wars that actually had a real purpose and a real cause as to why they were being fought, he felt it was time to really look at Vietnam because it was so unspoken about. Nobody talked about it. It was just hidden behind, the wall in the closet because of its epic failure. I think because Americans feel this is such an exceptional country, they feel like, we win every war that we go into. There's always a just cause related to these wars. Vietnam turned out to be a huge fiasco. And I think it really disillusioned the country in a major way that caused this split. between left and right in this country. And I think he felt it was time. 50 years later, it's time to reopen this and try to have a national discussion about why these divisions have occurred.
The key is the fact that nobody would talk about it. We have a clip from one of the early episodes, the first episode, about to set us up for this clip a little bit. It's about nobody talked about it, and only now baby boomers are asking what happened. Set us up for the clip. Who's speaking? And
Carl Molantis, who was a former Marine, and again was a very gung-ho participant in the war and thought it was a just cause when he first entered it, but had his mind changed in the course of fighting the war, and came back and became an anti-war activist. But he talks, very succinctly about the fact that it was all hidden away. His own wife didn't talk about it. He says it's like having an alcoholic father in the family, which is a great image that, this is what's happening, but we're just going to ignore it.
yeah, so let's have a look at that clip.
Coming home from Vietnam was close to as traumatic as the war itself. For years, nobody talked about Vietnam. We were friends with a young couple, and it was only after 12 years that the two wives were talking. Found out that we both had been Marines in Vietnam. Never said a word about it, never mentioned it. And the whole country was like that. It was so divisive. And it's like living in a family with an alcoholic father. Shh, we don't talk about that. Our country did that with Vietnam. It's only been very recently that I think that, the baby boomers are finally starting to say, what happened? What happened?
Well, there it is. I mean, I love how that's cut. The fact that they were friends for 12 years.
Yes.
And nobody mentioned that they both served as Marines in Vietnam.
Right.
And now we are able to look at what
Yeah.
happened.
And it's great, too, I think, that Carl mentions that the baby boomers are suddenly interested in trying to find out, what is the real story behind this war, because it is so little talked about. And the fact that he says, what happened? I mean, it's a perfect way, actually, to start the entire series, that bite. In the original editing, that piece, that soundbite actually was the opening, I think, of episode 7 or episode 8. And our co-director, Lynn Novick, the more we watched the show over and over again, she kept thinking, that's the perfect way to start the series. Let's move that to the head of the show. And so Carl became the opener.
Well, the other perfect way to start the series is the title sequence. Mm-hmm. We're going to show it. I just want to talk about it a little bit. The music is fabulous. Mm-hmm. It takes, I don't know, maybe we should show it and then talk about it. So just everyone pay attention. This is the title sequence to the Vietnam War. Let's look at it.
What happened?
What we need now in this country is to heal the wounds and to put Vietnam behind us.
The killing in this tragic war must stop.
Strategy is producing results. The enemy is no longer closer to victory.
No matter how you measure it, we're better off than we thought we would be at this time.
You have been less than candid as to how deeply we are involved in Vietnam.
We have increased our assistance to the government. It's logistics. We have not sent combat troops there.
You have a row of dominoes set up, and you knock over the first one, and the last one certainly did go over.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
Well, so we had to include that, what happened, and then talk about, to see the most iconic images of the whole war, and to hear those quotes, but to have it run in reverse is so effective for me. It even starts with that helicopter.
Yes. The
being
famous
pushed off
right.
and then coming back on board the ship.
Which was from 1975, and when the troops were leaving Saigon. This, I think, was a brilliant idea that Ken had, that we should do these reverse images in the opening in that way. And it works on so many different levels. In a certain way, it's almost like, can we take this horror back? Can we erase it? Can we erase it from the national memory? But of course, you can't do that. It's also a way of signaling to the audience that, this problem really started way back. Because the last figures that you see are de Gaulle and a French soldier crossing the rice paddies. So we're going back to French colonialism. And indeed, in episode 1, as you've seen last week, the film starts in 1858 with the Vietnam being taken over by the French. And it's important for Ken and our writer, Jeffrey C. Ward, they thought it was essential that the audience understand the kind of oppression that the Vietnamese suffered by the Chinese before the French, then through the whole French era, that their country has never really been their own. And unless we completely understood that background, we weren't going to quite understand why this war went so wrong. So again, for that reason, it was a great way to set up the fact that the French is going to be involved and that we are going to go that far back. There's also just something very mysterious and striking about the imagery going in reverse with that music going on that I think is very compelling. It really, just in a cinematic way, it just brings the audience in and makes them go, what is going on and what am I watching? And then you hear these, basically all of these presidents lying one after the other in terms of the reasons for why we get involved in this thing. So it's a perfect setup for the whole series. It really is. It's incredibly intriguing. And it's my colleague Tricia Reedy who cut that. And I think she did an absolutely brilliant job.
Yeah. For me to see the napalm going back up into the plane and the guerrilla who was shot point blank, to see him rise up again, it really takes a lot of what we knew and understood at the time about Vietnam and puts it on its head, turns it upside down. It lets you allow for a fresh interpretation.
Exactly. A resurrection in a certain way. As the man is coming up, it's like, can we take another look at this? Can we in some way get something positive out of this horror that we went through during that era? There's a kind of odd poetry to the whole thing in doing it in reverse. That's, I think, very, very intriguing.
One element that is so subconsciously effective is the music.
Yes.
For example, the music in that opening piece. But I want you to talk a little bit. I don't want to spend too long on it, but you've got Vietnamese folk songs woven in, and for us children of the 60s, the music of the 60s in place, original composers writing various pieces, Yo-Yo Ma.
Yeah.
And
well, the main score was composed by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails and his partner Atticus Ross. And they're known in the rock world for this hard rock music that they've written in the past. But what Ken and Lynn decided, they wrote a score for The Social Network, the David Fincher film, and they were so intrigued by that score and how different it was in the feature film world, and the power of that electronic music that they were writing, that they kept thinking this would be perfect for Vietnam and something different and new, and it would create this wonderful tension for the entire series. And when Lynn and Ken began showing Trent some of the clips, he was just blown away by some of the material, and it took a little bit of negotiation, but he finally agreed. And I think that Trent and Atticus came up with an amazing score that we've threaded through the entire series that I think is one of the great elements that works incredibly well in the film.
We're speaking today with Paul Barnes, who is the film editor for many parts of the long, beautiful Ken Burns, Lynn Novick Vietnam War series on PBS. The music that got me the most, I will tell you, because you edited the piece about the Vietnam Memorial Wall.
Yes.
And you used Bridge Over Troubled Water.
Right.
In many permutations and combinations. It is so moving. We can't show it because it hasn't aired yet, but
Yes.
I urge everyone to watch the last night of the series and watch that last half hour, because it moves toward reconciliation. It has the faces and voices of soldiers and families and protesters.
Mm-hmm.
The protester woman who says, I was just a kid too, and I'm sorry.
Yes.
I didn't know, what I was doing.
Yeah.
And it's just my favorite part. I still can't watch it without crying. Thank you. You did a magnificent job.
Well, thank you. I got incredibly emotional when I was editing it on a daily basis, believe me. I still feel like it's one of the most powerful. My two favorite memorials or monuments in the United States are the Statue of Liberty and the Wall. And they almost represent the best of America and the worst of America in a certain way. And they both are powerful emotional monuments and symbols of what this country is all about. I think Maya Lin's design is absolutely brilliant. It's a work of genius, I think. And I don't think there's anybody who goes there who isn't deeply affected by seeing all those names arrayed on that black granite. It still to this day, if I go, and I've gone many times, it still brings tears to my eyes. And so when you listen to these people and their reaction to it, like John Musgrave going and just falling on his knees, sobbing in tears, you realize how powerful it is. But it's very cathartic. I mean, it is a cathartic monument, and that's one of the reasons why I think Maya's design is so brilliant. People cannot help but become incredibly emotional when confronted with that.
58,000 soldiers lost their life. That's
right.
Pretty, when you take in the scope of that wonderful black granite with all their names in it.
Yeah.
Musgrave, let's talk about John Musgrave. One of the things he said, because he hadn't gone, when he did finally go, he said he collapsed sobbing.
Yes.
And then he realized that this is going to save lives.
Right.
So tell me about, this man, and then we're going to show a clip, another part of his own. But talk about who John Musgrave was. And
John, I think, is an extraordinary man. I mean, he's my favorite interview in the entire series. And when I first saw the interview, I was just blown away. I thought it was probably the best interview that Ken and the team has done since Shelby Foote in the Civil War, to be honest with you. He's such... What I love about him is, again, he went to the war with all the right reasons. I mean, he was a true believer. He believed he was anti-communist. He thought our president and our government was right. We had to prevent the communists from coming and taking over this country. He was a young man, 18 years old. He was brought up as a Christian. He was surrounded by vets from World War II that he admired deeply, and he wanted to be a hero like they were, because they were greeted as heroes when they came back from World War II and having defeated Nazism. And he wanted to go and do exactly the same thing. And then when he gets over there, he suddenly discovers how wrong-headed everything is, and then has to go through the most horrific experiences of, ambush after ambush after ambush. And his interview in the film is so honest. There's something about John, it's just he doesn't hold back, and you believe him totally with every incident that he talks about in the film. And I think he's a great guide through the whole series. I think there isn't a person in America who can't relate to him in some way, because there's just this beautiful inner soul in this man that you really trust and you believe and you feel for deeply.
Well, the clip that we're going to show is from him when he was a young soldier and was given a listening post in Compiègne.
Yes.
And he describes what it was like to be out there, 3 Marines with a radio,
right,
and the danger and how scary it was. But then he brings it back to his life and his children, and it's another deeply moving piece. Let's look at it.
I was assigned a listening post at Compiègne in the fall. That was like getting a death sentence at a trial, because that's just 3 Marines out there with a radio. And that's the scariest thing I did. You're listening for the enemy. They call you on the radio every hour. Delta Lima Papa 3 Bravo, Delta Lima Papa 3 Bravo, this is Delta 3. If your sit rep is Alpha Sierra, key your handset twice. If your situation report is all secure, break squelch twice on the handset. And if it's not, they keep thinking you're asleep, so they keep asking you, if your sit rep is Alpha Sierra, and then it finally dawns on them, maybe there's somebody too close for you to say anything. So then they say, if your sit rep is negative Alpha Sierra, key your handset once, and you damn near squeeze the handle off the, and two on the radio, because they're so close that you can hear them whispering to one another. And that's scary stuff. That's real scary stuff. And I'm scared of the dark, still. I still got a nightlight. When my kids were growing up, that's the first time they really found out that Daddy'd been in a war, when they said, well, why do we need to outgrow our night lights? Daddy's still got one.
Well,
I have to tell you, the whole series used to open with the nightlight scene. That's the way, when we were cutting it early on, John was the prologue for the entire series. And then we had the backwards sequence that we talked about just a little while ago. And then again, as I said, Lynn had the idea of moving Carl Belantis and what happened to the front. And so John was a little stranded. And I kept thinking about my show, episode 2. And I kept thinking, my opening is a little weak there, If you're taking John out of 1, can I have him?
Yeah.
And Ken was like, yeah, let's try John at the head of episode 2, because we've met him as a young man in episode 1, going off with these great ideals of fighting the war. Now let's come back to episode 2 and have another little note of the horror of the war as we're continuing to develop the history. And there's something about the nightlight. It's just, again, in terms of telling the story of Vietnam with these soldiers, kind of a history from the bottom up, their anecdotes are so telling in a way. It's like just that one little telling detail of the nightlight, of saying, okay, kids, you're getting too old, you shouldn't have a nightlight anymore. And they going, but Dad, you still have one.
Yeah. Because
of his fear of the dark, his fear of those voices at the listening post, of hearing the Vietnamese, just feet away from him. To this day, he still has a nightlight, to be honest with you. That fear has never really left him.
And what it also reminds me, as we did with that opening quote with Carl, that nobody talked about it. They were raising those kids without telling that Daddy had been in the war and what it was like.
Yes.
They wanted to protect them from that.
Yeah.
But the kids are calling them out, saying, wait a minute, why should we outgrow our nightlights if Daddy still has one?
I know. It took John a long time to open up, to be honest with you. I mean, he went through a real struggle, I think, as many Vietnam vets have done, of not wanting to talk about the horrors that he had to witness and go through. And I think he finally discovered, again, it was a kind of catharsis of telling the stories. It almost goes back to Homer. It's like you tell the tales and you relive them, and something happens that, you kind of cleansed. You can wash them away. You can deal with them in a certain way. You can share them. And you suddenly realize that other people have had similar experiences. And I think that's a part of why Ken wanted to do the show. It's tell the tale, tell the stories, relate it to everybody. Let the people know what happened there. Let them know what you went through and went about. It's cathartic for all the vets in the film, both South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, and U.S. guys. For all of them, it was cathartic. And I think that that's the kind of response he's hoping the country might have. And we'll be able to then share with each other.
And by naming that last episode, The Weight of Memory, from Tim O'Brien's What They Carried, what they carried were those memories and the pain of them, and they carried each other too.
Right.
And to get that out into the light of day and to say, I want to share this, help me with my burden, and then people step up and do it.
Exactly.
So these two themes that I wanted to look at today, which is the fact that nobody wanted to talk about it, and then as evidence in your beautiful piece about the wall, reconciliation, the freedom of reconciliation, redemption.
Right.
You talk a little about the normalization of Vietnam and the soldiers going back and meeting people they fought against and the bond that they had.
No, it's actually in episode 10 you'll see it's the vets returning to Vietnam and wanting to meet their counterparts, the North Vietnamese, and who they had been their enemies. And the kind of bonding that happened between the two sides after all those years. And as one of the soldiers at the end of the film says, it's not quite a cleansing, but there is a kind of peace that descended on him by having this trip back and being able to kind of talk to his old enemy, who he now began to feel was a brother.
And I think what this whole project does is provide not closure, because it's still very vital and painful for a lot of people,
Yes.
but to be able to look at it with 50 years distance and to know what worked and what did. We have a lot to learn from this.
Exactly, and I mean, one of the things about the series, I think, is that there's an elegiac quality to it, because in many ways it happened 50 years ago, and we all thought at the time, we hope we've learned some really good lessons from this horrible war that was a failure. But it's like recent events. All of a sudden, we found we're still repeating history again in a bad way. We really haven't really learned the lessons of Vietnam. And there's something deeply sad about that. It's like, again, why we wanted to do the series. It's like to remind people of the horror of this war and really make people think hard about, we can't let these things happen again. We can't let our presidents lie to us. We can't so trust our government without questioning them. We can't let our young sons and daughters go into these horrible situations and die for no good reason. There has to be a really good cause, a really good reason why the U.S. needs to get involved in these situations
And there has
before
to be
we let any more of our young folks die.
A distinct goal that we will know. We can't just get involved in endless war.
Yes.
And keep these things. You end with the works. I think Jeffrey West wrote about the second most divisive war in American history that we hadn't healed, and that he said the Vietnam War was a tragedy, immeasurable and irredeemable, but meaning can be found in the individual stories of those who lived, courage, perseverance, and you tell these individual stories in such a beautiful way. I really want to thank you.
Yeah.
What do you want?
Well, it's just a great tribute to our vets and the gift they gave us, not just the Americans, but the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese as well, because I think the stories they tell just open up a whole new perspective on what this war was like because of those personal stories they tell.
And those stories invite us to understand and forgive and perhaps achieve reconciliation. Thank you so much for everything you've done.
Right,
our guest
thank
today
you.
is Paul Barnes, a film editor for the many episodes of Ken Burns' The Vietnam War, Ken Burns and Lynn Novak.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Lorene.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.